Yeah, this is a direct continuation, and it's following on from what I was recording just earlier. And so it's about more of Tom Cheetham, The World Turned Inside Out, Henry Corbin, and The Angel Out Ahead. And so I might request that someone would go back to the previous video because that's where I give a lot of the necessary context. I'll try and do another little bit here. Basically, it's a sort of, yeah, combination of Schmachtenberger and Vervaeke to try and talk about a practical response to, at this point, this sort of how to apply Neoplatonism to sort of recover a relationship with nature that might be more functional in some way or more sensitive. That's very rough. And then, so what am I talking about specifically? Well, yeah, so through Viveki, we have this sort of a prescription of, hey, we need an ecology of practices with community of practitioners with a viable worldview in order to execute a kind of cultural response to meaning crisis. And then also through Daniel, we have, hey, there's a meta crisis as well. So not only the ecology, but also, economics, geopolitics, and, there's a kind of a lot to what's going on. And so the idea would be that we need some forms of, let's say, collective intelligence to in group process to come up with new forms of sort of creative problem solving and again, yeah, collectively minded response to the situation over and above wisdom school models. And so that's the kind of general sphere of what I'm talking about. It's kind of like what once we get into those kinds of context, then what comes up? And one of the answers, one of the framing questions has been so like what should we practice? And one of John's answers was sort of dialogical, imaginal, mindful, and embodied practices. And then the question is, great, but what's the imaginal and how can it support us? And then it's like that's how I get to study Henry Corbin and Jung as well as Heidegger. And then the questions would be sort of, okay, what's the relevance of that here? Well, okay, so the idea is, let me see if I can articulate it. Through McGilchrist, we have a sort of, again, we need to downregulate the tyranny of the left hemisphere and upregulate the let's say uh, forgotten or underlying functionality of the right hemisphere, which involves perceiving and learning to perceive the living quality of things, which is not animism, but something different than that. I've talked about that in the language of ensoulment and re-ensoulment that we can understand again through Jung and Corbin. So it's about personification um, and imaginal work in that context. And McGilchrist applies that particularly to our relationship with ourselves, with the other, with nature, and with the sacred. And sort of that's another way to, that's sort of one way of talking about once we have this ecology of practices and this sort of the sense of collective intelligence and the we space and the Geist that can come out of that, sort of where should that be applied? If we can talk about a sort of self-generating feedback loop of group flow or baseline consciousness being sort of raised in that context, where could that be applied, or what direction could, or yeah, and the idea is that it could be applied in relation to our interiority. That's where a lot of Corbin stuff comes in, Jung as well. But then also in relationship to the other. And then I would say if I capitalize the other and sort of deify the other, then there are different dimensions or aspects of that other. And then I would talk about the tripartite nature of the soul. I would say heavenly, human, and earthly aspects of quote unquote the other. Yep. And so then I can talk about it's generating new models of culture, right? It's deepening and restoring, renewing culture. And the idea is in application to our relationship not only with self and three aspects internally, I would say, but then also to the other, which is in a sense exterior. I know that's problematic, but so oriented toward the transcendent as such. We could just call that God if you like, but there's a way that God's supposed to be all of it. So, but to the transcendent, and then to sort of anima and anima mundi, soul and soul of the world. And that looks like an ecology of souls, basically, and the work that involves personification and imaginal work. And then the other one is to nature. So can we orient toward nature? What does it mean to orient to nature in this way, and to try to apply the stuff about the development of wisdom in group practice to change, to transform our relationship not only with ourselves and who we are, but to nature. Okay, now I have to shut up. Okay, so now I can sort of try and get a little bit more specific. So in that context, and the context of wanting to focus on, I guess it's a bit of theory, right? Obviously, about how in a sense, our relationship with nature could be updated via the renewal of culture and via imaginal work in group practice. Then that's how I got back into chapter 7 in the text, which is Tom Cheetham, The World Turned Inside Out, which is called The Angelic Function of Beings. And there's then more from that point because that's how I got to talk about Neoplatonism and Proclus, and sort of what can I say about that? It's difficult. So we were sort of talking about sort of talking about co-evolution with of the human and natural, and we were talking about uh, imaginally cultivating imaginally cultivated modes of perception. So the idea being that we can practice in such a way as to develop the capacity to, I mean, it's yeah, modes of perception or modes of being. So there's obviously Heideggerian flavors of that. But what I'm talking about, what do I mean by that? If I put it in a different way, I would say that we sort of see that the ego experiences this deep fear that I was talking about last time of sort of the vastness of reality, the infinite vastness of reality, and the we have a sense of powerlessness at a sort of existential level. And so that's how I got to sort of talk about these deep wells of different emotion in, I would call the collective unconscious, but however you want to talk about it. The idea being that from out of that insecurity, the predator-prey circuitry gets exapted into the tendency to immobilize, to dominate and control nature and ourselves and others like that, to immobilize. And there's this sort of fear of transcendence and fear of who we really are and what nature really is. And so that's a sort of the existential rooting of a lot of our sort of collective wounds. The idea being, is it possible to cultivate not only access to gnosis, access to transcendence as a kind of spiritual resourcing that can then be redeployed to cathart some of that, right? But also that by doing that, by working with some of that deep existential stuff, we can there's a feedback relationship between learning to do that deep kind of existential catharsis work that has to do with powerlessness, the fears of the ego, fear of transcendence, and so on, exaptation of predator-prey circuitry, tending toward game theoretic dynamics, dogmatism, the will to power, blah, blah, blah. There's a feedback between that and dealing with that, and also cultivating the capacity for what is being talked about through Proclus and Corbin as sympathy with nature and imaginal practice. So the idea is that by down regulating those existential fears, but meaning being with them and so on, like that kind of work, that we can unlock, cultivate, develop the capacity for imaginal perception. And so this is where the stuff about theoria and theosis and noesis but I'm talking about too much. So I would then just say we're talking about a way of perceiving nature differently. So rather than dominating and controlling and exploiting nature, can we deal with some of the underlying fears and insecurities and so on that cause that? And then if we can do that, can at the same time we generate an alternative way of looking at and being with the world that can be talked about as sympathy with nature. Another way to talk about that is sort of correspondence. And this is what's coming through Corbin and Proclus, as well as well, many people, right? But also Ibn Arabi, Surawadi, this is through Corbin. And so it's a imaginal, this is what Corbin means by the imaginal world. So there's a deep tie here between uh, through, between agape, personhood, cultivating presence, recognizing nature, and imaginal work. They're all tied together. That was also going along with we're sort of talking about a single process in a way, although it's obviously a multifaceted and complex process of uh, collective development of wisdom. Yeah, that is through Heidegger, a cultivation of presence in place and dwelling, but it's also about soul work, soul and the world, soul and soul of the world. I know that was a lot, so I should probably stop and say, I don't know what to say then. What I'll say then is that what I have there is a sort of position. That's a sort of a leaving off place, a waypoint from which it's possible to talk about how imaginal practice, imaginal work, work with the soul, all the stuff through Corbin and Jung, as well as Heidegger, can be applied to our relationship with nature. And so Corbin talks about this in terms of the angelic function of beings, where by doing sort of soul work in the interiority, cultivating what he calls a relationship between sort of higher and lower aspects of the soul, or the human aspect of the soul and the divine double, or Socratic daimonion, is what Corbin talks about. The idea being that that kind of relationship can result in the kind of an amnesis of quote unquote a being that can unlock again more modes of presence, different modes of being, from out of which it's possible to have sympathy with nature and to recognize, quote unquote, the angelic in nature, which is in a way through Proclus the way that all beings aspire toward the one. Okay, so I mean, I know that was a lot, and now now I'm going to continue. So what I was talking about just at the end of the last one, which was long, right, was these fears that sort of get in the way. So what Cheetham and Corbin were talking about is sort of we can say, okay, great, it's good to cultivate this kind of sympathy with nature, is the way that this is being talked about, which is sort of again a Neoplatonism applied to a theosophy, theosophy of nature, I think I would say. That's what he's going to talk about. And it's nature deified, although I'm not reducing the divine to nature, saying that nature obviously participates in the divine and that we can cultivate a recognition for that. So what gets in the way of that? And on the one hand, we had the will to power, right? And the and the fear and the sort of need for dominance and control of the ego, blah blah. And so I'm just going to repeat that quote, and then we talk about a different uh, blockage as a kind of pious asceticism or puritanism. And to Corbin, and Cheetham, these are sort of different forms of idolatry. And so that's where I'm going from here. It's like, yeah, I don't know if anyone else is getting this stuff, but I'm certainly right in the thick of it, as you can tell. And I have a couple more pages to go in this section, and the first few pages already created a couple hours worth of helpful, what I found to be quite helpful material. So I'm going to now continue into from page 188 in the middle of the chapter with Tom Cheetham and Corbin and co. Tom Cheetham, The World Turned Inside Out. Henry Corbin and the Angel Out Ahead. Quote unquote, inability to experience such sympathy, again, with nature, may come from two sources. On the one hand, it may come from a fear of the infinite vastness of reality and the powerlessness of the ego to dominate and control it. Corbin says, the cause may be a will to power, dogmatic or otherwise, which wishes to immobilize beings and forms at the point where man has immobilized himself, perhaps out of a secret fear of the infinite successions of perpetual transcendences. and the knowledge that to be faithful to the angel is precisely to let ourselves be guided by him toward the transcendences that he announces. And so I talked about that quote extensively last time in sort of last half an hour to 45 minutes of the last video in the series. And I talked about it in the context of game theoretic dynamics and solving multipolar traps, where the understanding is that that game theory is deeply related to these kinds of fears in a kind of exaptation of predator-prey circuitry. I have to get you now before you get me, that kind of thing. And that was a very fruitful discussion, I felt, because it involves sort of re-emphasizing the sort of bottom-up emergent solutions to game theoretic problems rather than top-down legalistic and bureaucratic uh, ways of dealing with those problems. It's like less about agreement fields and more about what I would call 4E re-ensoulment, recognizing ourselves as nature, and then dealing with self-destructive tendencies at the same time. Self-recognition is not sufficient. Now, continuing with Cheetham, who says, we moderns have come to believe that the pre-Copernican, pre-modern world of the angelic hierarchies was anthropocentric, cramped, and stifling. In truth, a closed world. But it is not so. It is our world of endless material extension, dominated by a merely human reason, that is the snare and the deadly delusion. Okay, well, there's a couple of points there immediately. So the pre-Copernican, pre-modern world was left behind for reasons, and we would need to account for those reasons. So yes, I think we can see the profound value in personification and in relating imaginally, so to speak, as cultivating personhood and indeed being constitutive of personhood. The idea that we're already doing that, and it's just about recognizing more of what we're already doing in a sense. So okay, but then there are ways in which such hierarchies, and again, like the imaginal world, imaginal perception, could be cramped and stifling. Like to me, it's not really enough to say, oh, it's not like that. It just sort of flips it in a way that's quite simple. And so it's like, yeah, but we did gain a lot of extension in through modern perception. Like one example is I published some of the first couple chapters of Richard Tarnas's Cosmos and Psyche, which may be like, terrible for a lot of people to, but it's like the point is that that goes into great detail about the Copernican revolution and about the expansion of consciousness that went along with that change. And I think what Cheetham is saying just doesn't account for that at all. So I would say this is too simplistic, and there are kinds of cramping and stifling that go along with that, with those angelic hierarchies. I think it would be fair to suggest, and we would need to work out what those are and how to account for them, as well as being honest about the advantages of science and so on. And I can imagine that Viveki's stuff is going to be very helpful with that. So that it's not like, because there's a very easily sort of Christian fundamentalist, oh, it's all hierarchies of angels, and we fall back into the heaven and hell trap. And I don't like that two worlds mythology stuff. But I'm not trying to create a straw man. I'm just noticing that there are concerns with, again, just readopting medieval Islamic cosmologies that we left behind for reasons that involved the Renaissance and the Reformation and so on, that these guys never really dealt with in some way. But anyway, having named that, I will now address the other reason that this failure of sympathy can come about, according to Corbin and Cheetham. Cheetham says, on the other hand, Corbin says, the failure of sympathy may be due to a pious asceticism or Puritanism, quote, with all its furies and rejections. I just stopped for a while, so I have to pick back into it, and it says, as we were saying. On the other hand, Corbin says the failure of sympathy may be due to a pious asceticism or puritanism with all its furies and rejections. So I would connect that with sort of a non a non-participatory mode of being, right? If it's this, there's kind of rejection or denial that goes along with sort of aestheticizing, and that's quite interesting. That like what I mean is sort of engaging with the surfaces, not participating deeply, being a witness or a spectator, in the Nietzschean sense, and then getting sort of overwhelmed by Dionysus. There's a way that asceticism is kind of equivalent to that in a sense. There's a way that it's a fundamental rejection or denial that's not participating in life. And so there's a way that I can see how that can result in failure of sympathy. Like it seems like sympathy here is sort of connected with, yeah, cultivating the capacity to participate in different modes of presence. And if we sort of denying different aspects of our being, so here there would be connection between sort of Puritanism and repression. That's fine. Cheetham continues. Just to clarify, I wouldn't want to reduce asceticism and Puritanism to what Corbin was saying, but we can see how cultivating the kind of sympathy with nature that he wants to discuss might only be compatible with certain kinds of asceticism. You know, we have to be quite careful about their relationship. Anyway, Cheetham continues. Such a soul, because it is itself frozen, can see in that dialectic of love, by means of which the soul is led from human love toward the celestial image of the beloved itself. Only the unconditional investiture in the sensible being. Okay, so for a start, that reminds me of Marie Louise von Franz' sort of hot evil and cold evil. The idea being that the reflectiveness gap, so through Viveki, so either you're sort of led around like a wanton by participating too much in your sort of impulses. This would be connected with hot evil. Whereas if you're sort of fall into the Hamlet-esque reflectiveness gap and you're only witnessing and watching, there's a kind of cold version of evil. And so from the point of view of that, where asceticism is Puritanism is a kind of frozenness of the soul. And the idea that is that from out of that point of view, from out of that perspective, there's a misperception, and it's a misperception of the relationship with nature. And it seems to be that the illusion would be that uh, quote unquote sensible being becomes an idol, and that the because the recommendation would be to quote unquote unconditionally invest in sensible being, but it's for the sake of transcendence, not exactly for the sake of sensible being itself. And this, from the point of view of the quote unquote frozen soul and the failure of sympathy that is asceticism, that would not be seen. The relationship that investiture in sensible being has to transcendence would not be seen. And in reality, that investiture, that dialectical love towards sensible being, toward participation in the world, qua world, that is supposed to lead, the soul is led in that way, quote unquote, from human love. So again, the dialectic of love is capitalized. So there's a small love and big love. And our human love, by investing in sensible being in this way, is led on a dialectic of love, quote unquote, from human love toward the celestial image of the beloved itself, which I would just language as toward transcendence, toward the one, which is also toward the divine double in this context, and by means of sympathy with nature, sympathy with beings. Hence, that point of view of the quote unquote frozen soul, quote, it can see that is only idolatry. It can see only profane love. And so, quote, isolating the sensible or imaginal from the spiritual divests beings, quote, of their aura. Again, isolating the sensible or imaginable from the spiritual divests beings of their aura. Gosh, I didn't think that he was going to say that. So, what does this imply? Yeah, so it seems that well, the implication is that when we sort of recover access to the spiritual in the way that's being described, that's being suggested, that we also recover a sense of the aura. And frankly, I have no idea what that means. So I'm just going to leave that be. The crucial emphasis here would be that we discussed two different ways in which this sympathy with nature, sympathy with beings, this ability to open oneself to the presence of things and persons becomes is not possible. And I describe them in other terms such as hot evil and cold evil through von Franz. And these basically involve uh, two different kinds of perspective, which are very limited and which misperceive in a biased way the dialectic of love, by which we can be led toward transcendence, toward gnosis. Yeah, so one of the issues here would be that it seems that that very dialectic of love is both what is prevented, that we're prevented from participation in that by the biases that were just mentioned, but it also seems that that dialectic of love, that our participation is prevented, that we're prevented from participating in, that is also the solution to those biases, which seems like a problem. And I think I would say there's a way of sort of starting up a little feedback loop, like tipping a snowball down the hill, where you have to sort of get it going in the right direction. We're not fundamentally stuck. Cheetham says, in either case, meaning in the case of the point of view of either of the biases mentioned, it is literalism, the paralysis of persons and objects into ontological immobility that prevents the perception of transcendence and produces the death, the hell of idolatry. Okay, so that's extremely important. So the idea here is that each of these biased points of view, either coming from, let's say ego-derived fear of the infinite vastness of reality and the will to power that comes in consequence. This is a kind of bias, let's say. Or on the other hand, by the frigidity of the soul in its asceticism and puritanism and non-participatory Hamlet-esque, reflectiveness. Either of these kinds of bias perspective are ultimately nihilistic. Nihilism in the first place through Nietzsche and the will to power, and in the second place, it's also nihilistic, but in a different way. There's a kind of cut or gap that can't be jumped across. Yep, and so either of these are taken as a kind of literalism. They're literalistic, meaning non-symbolic, and that's very interesting. That they're both fundamentalist in a certain way. They're both literalistic, non-symbolic, and they also involve paralysis. So that reminds me of existential entrapment through Viveki. That'd be episode 13. And I won't go on about paralysis. So he said paralysis of persons and objects. So f foreclosure of transformation, the in that we cannot be transformed, that we're stuck, that we feel stuck, or even that we don't know that we are stuck into quote unquote ontological immobility. And so this is great because this is where we get the emphasis on movement, right? And change and capacity and that this it's not just participation in a new mode, it's ongoing, evolving, iterating, being as that, being evolving, evolutionary being, being in the becoming. So ontological mobility. And these biases, they quote, prevent the perception of transcendence and produces the death, the hell of idolatry. Yeah, so properly, I would understand that transcendence, in a way, is in dialectic with immanence and would therefore correspond to one of the biases in a sense. So what I'm talking about is that, uh, yeah, uh, these different poles of bias, in a way, they correspond to transcendent and immanent. And so I would understand that one of them could perceive, and it doesn't really matter which one, actually. I mean, it kind of does, but it doesn't really. One of them would be able to see transcendence, perceive transcendence, but not perceive immanence, and vice versa. And so the idea would be that um, transcendence and immanence can only be properly understood by virtue of the other, in the same way as esoteric and exoteric. Um, so we would need both, and that's also an inherently symbolic way. Now we get a quote from Corbin about this idolatry. Corbin states, idolatry consists in immobilizing oneself before an idol because one sees it as opaque, because one is incapable of discerning in it the hidden invitation that it offers to go beyond it. So the idea here is that that seeing things in their opacity, seeing things as opaque, is seeing through things in a way is illusory, which is quite interesting. And the otherwise it would be if we can see things in their not in their opacity, but if we can see them clearly, just as they are. What I'm thinking of is in their way of shining forth, in their phenomena as images, right? Then we can see that they speak as symbols. Things are as they appear in some way. And moreover, in that appearing, they are an invitation to transcendence. They're an invitation to self-transcendence and self-transcendence by means of those very appearances, those very images, those very phenomena, rather than looking for the Kantian noumena behind it. As Corbin said, idolatry consists in immobilizing oneself before an idol because one sees it as opaque, because one is incapable of discerning in it the hidden invitation that it offers to go beyond it. Hence, the opposite of idolatry would not consist in breaking idols, in practicing a fierce iconoclasm aimed against every inner or external image. It would rather consist in rendering the idol transparent to the light invested in it. In short, it means transmuting the idol into an icon. Okay, so that's quite cool. It's something alchemical. Again, transmutation of idols into icons applied to our perception of things, our perception of, yeah, images, appearances. That's fine. I'll leave that there. We get a, yeah, I mean, reminding me of Barfield, and we're going to get a footnote about that. Cheetham states, Corbin's treatment of this issue is in many ways similar to the analysis of Owen Barfield in Saving the Appearances, and a comparison would be worthwhile. Also pertinent are connections with both Heidegger and Jung, as I've been discussing. In a anything to say about that? No, I won't say any more right now. In a profound study of the relationship between Jungian psychology and philosophical phenomenology, Roger Brooke comments that, quote, what analytical psychology calls images, phenomenology following Heidegger calls things. I've been using both terms. Brooks also relates archetypes to the notion of presence, as I've been doing. Quote, thus the archetype is not extraneous to the image, but is that quality of presence that leads to the depths of its own interiority. This is the spirit of Corbin. This is in the spirit of Corbin. At the same time, it needs to be stressed that the connections here are complex. Quote, I am convinced by George Steiner's contention in his book Martin Heidegger that Heidegger's phenomenology is an attempt to produce an ontology entirely without recourse to categories of transcendence. Yeah, and this is antithetical to Corbin's entire gnosis. Yeah, so in Heidegger, we don't get the stuff about transcendence really, or archetypes, or mythology that we get in both Corbin and Jung. Okay, so we'll move on here. Also relevant is Avon's new gnosis, which is, I've been going into that. Continuing, quote, in the garden, meaning the Garden of Eden, everything was an icon. After the fall, only the Gnostic has the sympathy that allows perception of the angelic function of beings. Everyone else sees idols. There's an interesting relationship here between sort of idolatry and literalism. This is sort of when we see things in such a way that is opaque, which in a way means seeing through them, then we're disconnected from transcendence and we fall into idolatry and literalism. On the other hand, if we can cultivate the capacity to see things in their transparency, then we're actually able to see things as images, as the phenomena, as the way that they shine forth, just as they are in their archetypal quality, in their quality of presence. And that transparency is access to transcendence. And there are some tricky loops in there that I can't go into that right here, but there's a tricky way that sort of seeing things just as they are is what facilitates access to transcendence, which seems counterintuitive. Whereas on the other hand, sort of looking at things in their opacity is a way of seeing them literalistically and as idols, which is also in a way counterintuitive. Cheetham continues, the Theosophy of nature is an iconology of a transformed world. Far from the static, human-centered world imagined and parodied by modern historical consciousness, this hierarchic, Neoplatonic, and medieval cosmos is in perpetual motion towards infinite, suprahuman divinity. There is nothing claustrophobic about this vision of the world. On the contrary, it may induce a kind of spiritual dizziness and intoxication of the heart. Okay, well, there are obviously risks with that. Again, the fear of wide open spaces, the fear of infinity. I also talked about how last time sort of self-confinement, self-enclosure, self-isolation can come about as a sort of fear-derived response to that infinite freedom. So I think there's a way that claustrophobia and whatever the opposite of claustrophobia, fear of wide open spaces is, I feel that they go together in some way. that they tend to go together. And so spiritual dizziness as an intoxication of the heart is another kind of risk. Yeah, where we can be, there's something addictive about that. Intoxication is not a, is usually a pejorative term. So I would suggest that this is, is that a vulnerability of the heart? The heart's capacity for intoxication, is that a good thing? I'll have to just leave that there. Cheetham continues. Just to, the implication would be that the spiritual dizziness, or yeah, orientation toward this hierarchic Neoplatonic medieval cosmos, creates this quote unquote intoxication of the heart, and that the solution for that would be groundedness, right? Groundedness toward the exoteric, toward the world, toward nature. Continuing, quote, it is based on an unending openness, unending openness that prevents the hardening of the heart, so characteristic of fundamentalisms of all kinds. Yeah, there's a trap there as well, because what I'm talking about is between finitude and transcendence, right? And so when we're not, we are limited and finite beings, and our hearts need to be hardened, actually, to participate in this world. And that's okay. That's okay. That's, yeah, because, and the reason for that is because we're human beings, and we're small. Anyway, he said, yeah, it's this dizziness is based on an unending openness that prevents the hardening of the heart, so characteristic of fundamentalisms of all kinds. I think it's an open question, which is ironic thing to say, whether the openness of the heart is a sort of unidirectionally a good thing. I think I've noticed people who can make mistakes by opening their hearts too quickly and too much. Um, tricky to talk about. Quote, this is unsettling to those seeking fixity and the armor of unfeeling certitude. Um, it's can be rational, quite rational to seek fixity. Anyway, we have a lot of work to do before we can break through a lot of our armoring, and an orientation to sort of get rid of the armor is, well, it's important to have in some way, but it's also a self-limiting position. I'm looking for the dialectic between transcendence and finitude, and I'm not seeing it here. Cheetham continues. In this world, Corbin says, the movement of the soul is perpetual. Quote, others have spoken of the necessity of a permanent revolution. I preach the necessity of a permanent hermeneutics. I definitely think that's valuable. Cheetham continues, this cosmology in Gothic style is a continual exaltation that depends upon a perpetual alchemy of resurrection, a formation and unfolding of the spiritual body. That's fine. It resonates with Christianity and the eternal return among, I mean, it's a lot, right? But so now we get a quote from Corbin who says, it may happen just as we've learned to understand alchemy as signifying something quite different. It may happen just as we've learned to understand alchemy as signifying something quite different from a chapter in the history or prehistory of our sciences. Yeah, that a geocentric cosmology will also be revealed in its true sense, having likewise no connection with the history of our sciences. Wow, that's really, really good. Yes, in the same way that alchemy is not about the prehistory of science, it's about spiritual alchemy, let's say individuation or cosmology too. Well, this should be compared with Jung's cosmology because if I'm right, then in Mysterium Conjunctionis, he did come out with a cosmology at the end. Again, the introduction to Cosmos and Psyche that I gave, I mean, Richard Tarnas gave it, but it's like a really helpful introduction to the ways that the through Pico della Mirandola, the Oration on the Dignity of Man, the Renaissance and the releasement of the soul in the Renaissance, getting out of the geocentric cosmology was so important, which is also not exactly foregrounded. Corbin was saying, considering the perception of the world and the feeling of the universe on which it's based, the geocentric cosmology, it may be that geocentrism should be meditated upon and evaluated essentially after the manner of the construction of a mandala. Well, obviously he says, it is this mandala upon which we should meditate in order to find again the northern dimension with its symbolic power, capable of opening the threshold of the beyond. So Corbin is clearly endorsing Jung. And Jung's whole point is that the mandala and what he calls the self, that the mandala is a symbol of, is an empirical reality. That Jung, in a way, doesn't belong to Jung. He just called it the self. We can call it whatever we want. So yes, there is a deep connection between what Jung calls the self and geocentrism and the geocentric cosmologies. Yeah, so this is sort of the collective dimensional, collective aspect of the self. I'll leave that as it is. Cheetham continues. It's clear now how Corbin can say, quote, psychology is indistinguishable from cosmology. Quote, the theophanic imagination joins them into a psychocosmology. It's just another way of, yeah, I don't see that really helps. But yes, yes, yes. I mean, through Jung as well, right? We get this, he was turning toward the sort of, in a way, the imaginal reality of archetypes. So he called archetypes as psychoid, meaning he was giving up his Kantianism and discussing the archetypes, for example, the numbers, as between psyche and cosmos and as structuring both. So Corbin and Jung are working together here. He says, this is Cheetham, knowledge of the imaginal world is simultaneously knowledge of the knower and the known. Knowledge of the imaginal world is simultaneously knowledge of the knower and the known. And in the last analysis, since idolatry is the result of blindness, all knowledge, even of the physical world, is imagination. True, but it's going to take us a while to feel that, I think. Corbin states, let us emphasize then that this does not mean knowing things as abstract idea, as philosophical concept, but as the perfectly individuated features of their image. Meditated, or rather premeditated, by the soul, namely their archetypal image. That is why in this intermediate world there are heavens and earths, animals, plants, minerals, cities, towns, and forests. Ultimately, what we call physis and the physical is but the reflection of the world of the soul. There is no pure physics, but always the physics of some definite psychic activity. That's hard. That's a really hard one. So, yeah, I think there's what he's talking about is the way of seeing that the sort of the way that we perceive the physical world is in some ways sort of ultimately derivable from the imaginal. But again, it's going to take us a while to feel like again that's an idea, right? It's an abstract idea, and it may or may not be true. I mean, it strikes me as true, right? But the question is, how do we feel that? let's get to the end here. Cheetham says, this is why William Blake, could say that the world imagined was more real, more detailed, more perfectly formed than the mere sensible world. And this means that the quantitative, literal space-time of opaque matter is only one form, although the most limited, of the infinite array of spiritual spaces and times. There is, strictly speaking, no endpoint to the upward motion of this meditative, imaginative, and sympathetic knowing, which is a movement towards paradise, drawn on by the love of beauty as the supreme theophany, and by the desire of that love. Each level in paradise, each level is paradise to the level below, but the beyond is not radically opposed to this world, though there is indeed a world beyond the grave. Okay, we now get a quote from Corbin to finish this off, but I think for me the sort of issues here is that it sounds so much like it's about just interiority, and the risk is of bypassing and not being involved and not getting that it's about groups and exteriority and involvement and participation, and that will do. Corbin says, rather, even while one is materially present in this world, there is a mode of being in paradise. But it goes without saying that this mode of being, paradise, can be realized, can exist in the true sense, only in a person who precisely is this paradise. That is to say, who always personifies this mode of being. Okay, so the realization of paradise is to personify the mode of being that is paradisal. That's interesting. Cheetham finishes, access to this world requires that true imagination that is the intermediary locus at the meeting place of the two seas, where Moses meets Kadir, the mundus imaginalis, the imaginal world. Yeah, so again, it's sort of paradise as the goal, and the imaginal world as sort of mediation on the way to paradise. And I mean, look, we do need our stories, but it's a little utopian for my taste. Um, but that's fine. I mean, it's kind of like whatever gets us there. But we've seen how this stuff can go awry as well in different ways that I don't see being accounted for. But in any case, what is there anything more from here? Well, that's the end of the section. And it might do to break this up, I think. So again, we've still been talking about sympathy with nature, the connections between Corbin and alignment between Corbin and Jung here, because essentially what he's saying is that meditation upon the self, upon the mandala, as spiritual alchemy, is the reorientation toward the vertical dimension of being. And so, yeah, I feel that we see again through Corbin even that there's a profound connection between quote unquote meditation on the self and individuation per se. But I think that's enough. I already talked about a lot, so I'll still leave it here. And we were talking about, yeah, different sort of bias perceptions that come from different kinds of trauma, I would say, that can prevent the dialectic of love that Cheetham and Corbin have been discussing in psycho-cosmological terms. The idea that we can reintegrate geocentrism just like alchemy. In orientation toward paradise, drawing on, yeah, love of beauty and theophany. Okay, I'll leave it at that.